I want to spend a little more time with 2 Samuel chapter 9 to begin with this evening. Now the reason is that I see in this chapter an amazing God pattern. Prophecy that's developing that has a direct impact on us. This is on the surface the story of King David and Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson. But underneath, it's a hidden message that couldn't have been recognized until Messiah Yeshua came and then the church age advanced. In the Hebrew teaching methods, this message would probably be placed in the sod category, it's called, as it definitely has an underlying mystical and messianic nature about it. And since chapter 9 is a relatively short one, and I see an important underlying message, you know what, maybe even a warning to us about something that needs to be revealed to the modern church, I want to take just a couple of minutes to reread it so we have the full context. So turn your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 9. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 342. 2 Samuel chapter 9. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, page 342. David inquired, "Is there anyone still alive from the family of Saul to whom for Jonathan's sake I can show kindness?" In Saul's household there had been a servant named Ziba, and they summoned him to David. And the king asked him, "Are you Ziba?" And he answered, "At your service." And the king said, "Is there anyone still alive from the family of Saul to whom I can show God's grace?" And Ziba said to the king, "Well, there's still Jonathan's son with the lame legs." And the king said to him, "Where is he?" Ziba answered, "He's there in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel in Lodabar." And King David sent and took him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel in Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David. And he fell on his face and he prostrated himself. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "Here is your servant." David said to him, "Don't be afraid, for I'm determined to be kind to you for the sake of Jonathan your father. I will restore you to all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you will always eat at my table." He prostrated himself and he said, What is a servant that makes you pay such attention to a dead dog like me?" And the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and he said to him, "I've given everything that Saul and his family owned to your master's grandson. You are to work the land for him. You, your son, your slaves, harvest the crops so that your master's grandson will have food to feed his family. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 slaves. And Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do everything my lord the king commands his servant, although Mephibosheth has been eating at my table as one of the king's descendants." And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. Everyone living in Ziba's house was a servant of Mephibosheth. But Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and he always ate at the king's table. And he was lame in both legs. In a nutshell, King David asks the hired caretaker of Saul's estate, the former King Saul, if there is anyone left alive of Saul's family. And at the bottom of David's interest is that more than 2 decades earlier, he had made a vow before the Lord to be kind to Saul's and to Jonathan's descendants once he became king. Now, inherent in David's question is, if a hereditary member of Saul's family is still alive, why isn't that family member in charge of Saul's estate instead of this Gentile foreigner, this household servant named Ziba? Now, last week we found out that the backstory for this narrative is that most of Saul's family had recently been executed by some Gibeonites in an act of blood revenge, a typical Middle Eastern vendetta for perceived wrongs committed by the former king. And even though David was not personally involved with the killings, he did openly approve of them. However, he told these Gibeonites that they couldn't harm Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. See, a remnant of Saul's family line must live on, or the family line would come to an end. And even so, Mephibosheth went off into hiding among the clan of Machir, which is part of the tribe of Manasseh, that was located on the Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan River, a place outside of the official promised land. Now, I'm telling you these details because I want you to remember them for something we're going to talk about very shortly. He lived over there because it was understood that these Gibeonites weren't going to quit until they had killed Mephibosheth. It was a matter of honor for them. And that was an order in all their blood revenge to wipe out all of Saul's descendants, so there'd be no more. Now, upon Ziva admitting that Mephibosheth was alive and well, David ordered that Mephibosheth be brought to the city of David to appear before him. Now, interestingly, Ziva makes it a point to mention that although an heir to Saul's estate was alive, alas, he was a cripple. And in the Bible era, cripples and blind people were despised by society, seen as useless burdens, whose afflictions were usually divine curses in consequence of displeasing God in some way. That's what they thought about it. Now, David assured Mephibosheth that despite his lame condition, not only would he be welcomed back into David's kingdom, even live in the capital city of Jerusalem, but that the king would personally protect and provide for him. Further, Mephibosheth was to be given legal possession and authority over his grandfather, King Saul's former estate. And so in a reversal of fortunes, the Gentile Ziva was now to work on his behalf in order to provide for Mephibosheth's family and whatever remained of Saul may have remained of Saul's descendants. Ziva submitted to this request, but he made it clear that Mephibosheth had been eating at his table, meaning that Ziva, as the head man in charge of Saul's estate, had graciously seen to it that Mephibosheth was given enough to live and was not being neglected. See, this was actually quite an arrogant and boastful attitude on the part of Ziva, because he in no way owned or possessed Saul's estate. He had no right to it. He was a servant. Saul's estate wasn't his. He just benefited from it because of all the circumstances. But it was neither his own merit nor his legal entitlement to the estate that allowed him to benefit from it. Rather, it was King David's chesed, the king's kindness, that permitted this Gentile foreigner to partake of what rightfully belonged to an Israelite family, King Saul's family and his descendants. Now, to be clear, Ziva had apparently been a reasonably faithful caretaker of this estate. He wasn't doing anything wrong. This wasn't an evil man. He wasn't an enemy of David's kingdom. However, he did overestimate his own position. And to a degree, he misappropriated for himself what was by nature a Hebrew inheritance. Thus, although David put Mephibosheth into ownership of the estate, it was his legally anyway. David in no way punished, he didn't chastise Ziba. Rather, it's just that their roles were straightened out. The Israelite, Mephibosheth, was now the owner in possession of the estate. Ziba, the Gentile, was still a supervisor. He was certainly allowed to benefit from the land and from the relationship, but no longer as the self-appointed ultimate authority, above that of even the hereditary family member of Saul. Now, we ended last time by reading a portion of Romans 11. And most of you seem to have made the intended connection, but I would like to clarify and validate the point. What I feel certain about is that what we have here, in addition to a very real, literal event that's recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 9, is a significant prophecy. And it's the revelation of a God pattern. And it's generally been overlooked. We have a pattern that foreshadows the relationship of Hebrews to Gentiles in general, especially as it pertains to the Gentile church, and a hint of the return of the Jews to the promised land from the Roman exile. See, what needs to be remembered about prophecy is that characteristically, prophecies happen and then they happen again at a later time, sometimes more than once. See, here's the mysterious connection I want you to see. King David is used here as an intended illustration of King Yeshua, King Jesus. Mephibosheth is an intended illustration of the exiled Israelites, or in modern vernacular, the Jews. Ziba is an intended illustration of the Gentile church. And Mephibosheth's return from his hiding place in the Transjordan, outside of the Promised Land, back to Jerusalem. This is an illustration of the Jews coming home from being scattered outside the Promised Land, living with and under the authority of foreigners for centuries. Now let me carry this through in a way that I hope will help you see it better by following this storyline of 2 Samuel chapter 9 and now inserting the prophetic characters. Israelites king, Messiah, asks the Gentile church, the temporary caretaker of the Israelite estate, if there are any hereditary Israelites left. Are there any left that can claim allegiance to Israel's God and thus have rightful land claims to the land of Israel? And this is because if there are any hereditary Israelites left, then the Messiah has picked this moment to bring them back to their own land inheritance, which they have legal right to and always have, and set them back in charge of it again. The Gentile caretaker, the church, who was essentially assigned the job of taking care of the Israelite estate, did so, but in doing so has generally held itself aloof over the Israelites and tells the Messiah, the king, oh yes, there's hereditary Hebrew members of the land still alive, but you know what? They're lame. They're disabled. They can't do anything. That is, the church tells Messiah that the Jews are so spiritually crippled They're so despised in this world that they're totally incapable of assuming their rightful roles as possessors and owners of what one time had been their exclusive inheritance. And in fact, it was their spiritually crippled condition that caused their authority to be held back from them and instead turned over to this Gentile caretaker. And on top of that, this Gentile caretaker, the church, well, it's a little bit offended. It's a little bit put off when after so many years of this nice arrangement where the church lorded over the Israelite estate and over the Jews, the church suddenly, out of the blue, is challenged by the king, the Messiah. And the king makes it clear that he certainly doesn't see the Gentile church, Siva in our story, as the new owner of the Israelite inheritance, to the exclusion of the living legal owners, the Jews, even though the caretaker, the church, felt he had earned that privilege, was confident that the king, the Messiah, had intended to give it to him all along. So at an unexpected moment, after years of it being otherwise, the Messiah, the king, he reverses the pecking order. Oh my. The King of Kings sets the spiritually crippled, lame, formerly oppressed and despised, but legal Hebrew landowner over the Gentile caretaker who had formerly overseen matters for so many years. The Hebrews who are blood related to the king, to the Messiah, are now restored to their rightful position. They're brought back from a foreign land to their own land inheritance, as promised to them in the time of Abraham. In fact, simply living in the land, back on their estate, isn't good enough for the king. That's not good enough. The Hebrews have to also live in the capital city, Jerusalem, right next to where the king's going to live. There, the Messiah, the king, is going to protect them. He promises. He's going to protect for them. He's going to provide for them. They're going to eat at the king's table. And as you're probably aware, modern Israel moved back into their land as the legal owners in 1948. But they didn't recover Jerusalem until 1967. God intended for them to have both. Just as we see that Mephibosheth was to have his own estate inside the land of Israel, but also the security and privilege of living in Jerusalem, right next to the king. Now, maybe this doesn't impact you like it does me. I got to tell you, I laughed. I shed tears. I got shivers down my spine when this struck me, what was going on here in 2 Samuel. But then as I investigated Mephibosheth's future, after he was restored by King David, that we just read about, I found even more. You see, this isn't the last time that we're going to hear of Mephibosheth in the Bible. First, since our time's short, we're only going to read a few verses. The context is that King David's own son has now rebelled against him, and he's pulled off a coup. Avshalom has tried to take over the throne of Israel from his father, and he succeeded to some measure, and King David is on the run from him. Open your Bibles just a few more pages ahead from where you are now to 2 Samuel chapter 16. And we're going to just read the first 4 verses together. 2 Samuel chapter 16, page 351 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. When David had gone a little past the summit, there was Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who met him with a pair of donkeys, saddled, on them 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, 100 pieces of summer fruit, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, "What do you mean by these?" And Ziba replied, "Well, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and the summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine is for those who collapse in the desert to drink." And the king asked, "Well, where is your master's grandson?" And Ziba answered the king, "Oh, he's staying in Jerusalem. Because he said, today the house of Israel will restore my father's kingship to me." And the king said to Ziba, "Everything that belongs to Mephibosheth, now it's yours." And Ziba answered, "I bow down before you. May I find favor in your sight, my lord, my king." See, this is really interesting. Because here we have the characters from 2 Samuel chapter 9 appear to us again. The Gentile Ziba, who in a role reversal is now under Mephibosheth's authority, comes to King David with all these offerings and gifts. And he tells the king that he is personally bringing these to him because, well, his master, Mephibosheth, he preferred not to come by his own choice, almost as a defiance. Rather, Mephibosheth, well, he was comfortable where he is. And he's not at all honoring of the king's precarious position, his need for support at this very moment. But Ziba, who says he values David as king of Israel, he says, "Here I am with all these gifts." Now the king's angry. He's pretty upset. And he says to Ziba, "Everything that belonged to Mephibosheth, now it's yours." Now in many ways, this might seem to shoot holes in a lot of what I just taught you. And it especially seems to uphold the doctrine held by much of the modern church that follows replacement theology. The notion that the Gentile church has replaced Israel as God's chosen, and God has rejected his chosen people. In other words, using the pattern of the story of David and Mephibosheth as prophetic, here we have Messiah telling Israel that since the Gentile church has been more faithful to him than Messiah's own fellow Jews have been, he's taken everything away from them that they at one time had given to them. He's given it all to the Gentile church instead. Is this not exactly what many of us grew up with in the church? It was what I grew up with. It's what I heard. Isn't this what the church espouses today, for the most part? And therefore it supposedly validates that despising the Jewish people and believing the Jews have no right to the land of Canaan is how we're supposed to view things. That's what we're supposed to do. See, it would be hard to argue against that if we stop reading the story here. But it continues. In 2 Samuel chapter 19, something else astounding happens. But before we read it, I want to quickly give you the context. David's son, Absalom the rebel, is now dead. The rebel son has died. And so God's anointed King David is now restored back to the throne of Israel. David is on his way now to Jerusalem when he is met on the road by none other than the lame Mephibosheth. So, go forward a few more pages in your Bible to 2 Samuel chapter 19. And we'll start reading at verse 25. Yep, 25. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, page 356. And we'll read from 25 through 30. Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He hadn't been caring for his legs, trimmed his beard, or washed his clothes from the day the king had left till the day he came home in peace. And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" And he answered, "My lord king, my servant deceived me. I, your servant, had said, I will saddle a donkey for myself to ride on. I will go with the king, since your servant is lame. But he slandered me, your servant, to my lord the king. However, my lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever seems right to you. For all my father's household deserved death at the hand of my lord the king. Nevertheless, you placed your servant with those who eat at your own table. I deserve nothing more. Why should I come crying any more to the king?" The king said to him, "Why speak any more about these matters of yours? I say to you, you and Ziva divide the land." Turns out, Ziva, the Gentile caretaker, Mephibosheth's servant, deceived his master. So he deceived the king. I think he also deceived himself to a degree. Mephibosheth was properly so in the proper process of bringing gifts to the king, because he was saddling a donkey to go with the king, to follow him wherever he went. He was showing him allegiance, when all of a sudden, the Gentile caretaker took everything his Hebrew master had prepared. He presented it to the king as though it was from himself. Then he lied. And he said that the Israelite had no interest in following the king. David immediately realized he'd been duped by this foreigner. But David's solution was surprising and interesting. He said, "Okay, split the estate. You'll both have a portion in the kingdom of God." After all, Ziva had been a long-term caretaker of the estate, even though the estate was technically Mephibosheth's legal inheritance. Ziva had elevated his own self-importance, but that wasn't a disqualifier. Each party would benefit from the estate, each in their own way. The Gentile and the Hebrew both had a reasonable claim to participation in the benefits of Israel's land and of Israel's covenants. Folks, I hope you see this. Can you see this prophetic illustration in this story? This God pattern. And, if you would, the condemnation to a degree of us, the church. What have we done over the centuries to the Jewish people? But it also speaks of the Jews' incorrect idea that nobody but they have a place before the God of Israel. Unless, of course, you convert to Judaism. As well as rejection of God's view of the situation as both parties having rights. See, we've deceived the Israelites and we've deceived ourselves in the process. We've told them that they're only welcome to follow their own Israelite Messiah and partake in the benefit of their own legal inheritance if they essentially give up their Hebrew heritage and become Gentiles like us. We've been saying, you can join us, you can eat at our table, if you'll follow certain conditions. The Hebrews were getting ready to follow their Messiah. Listen, we hear in the New Testament of thousands upon thousands of Jews believing in Yeshua. And we're going to talk about that some more tomorrow in the book of Daniel. But the Gentiles came along, wrested away control, created the Roman church, and then made the Hebrews feel unwelcome and disinherited. The Gentiles took the offerings that the Israelites had prepared for the Messiah, confiscated the inheritance that had been prepared for the Israelites, and claimed it all. Then we went to King Messiah and we said, these offerings are from us. Because the Israelites that you put in charge of the royal state, they don't want to follow you. But it wasn't true. For a time, the Gentile Ziva, the church, goes back to the Israelite estate, assumes control, believing we've attained our rightful place that we've earned by means of our declaration and in consequence of Israel's spiritual lameness. But later on, the king finds out from the Israelite Mephibosheth that the Gentile Ziva had misled him. The Hebrew had fully intended on following the king, the Messiah. But the Gentile interrupted the process, took all the gifts, claimed all the inheritance for himself, and thus wrongly put himself above the Hebrew, effectively even excluding the Hebrew. And then later, after the kingdom had been wrestled back from the arrogant Gentile, and as the king, the Messiah, nears his bittersweet return to Jerusalem, he looks and he sees the crippled, the disheveled Hebrew Mephibosheth, who's trying to bring gifts. And he asks, why didn't you follow me before? And the Hebrew responds, I was going to, but I was slandered. I was slandered and deceived. They took my offering. They didn't tell you the truth. And now they've tried to take my inheritance away from me. Now I'm not even sure I have a place in your kingdom anymore. I don't even know if I have a right to ask for it. And the king says, there's no need for this. Of course you have a place in the kingdom. In fact, you both have a place in my kingdom. And I'm going to see you on equal footing. And he splits the right to partake of the estate. Romans 3. (29 and 30) says this, or is God the God of the Jews only? Isn't he also the God of the Gentiles? Yes, he is indeed the God of the Gentiles, because as you will admit, God is one. Therefore he will consider righteous the circumcised on the ground of trusting, and the uncircumcised through that same trusting. In our time, the King of Kings has restored the Hebrews to their rightful inheritance. But as the Gentile caretakers, we've not been very comfortable with this turn of events. We've been kind of struggling with what all that means. Where do we fit now? That the prophecies of Israel's rebirth as a nation of Hebrews has become a reality. This wasn't supposed to happen. Took way too long. How do we handle that all these centuries of our erecting a wall of separation between us and the Jewish people is now being challenged and dismantled by God? What do we do about all those man-made church doctrines that take Israel's inheritance from them and give it to us? Now that Israel's return makes it crystal clear that those doctrines were misguided. They were never right. I'd like to think that this is at the core of what Seed of Abraham Ministries and Torah class is all about. I could spend a long time talking about the history of the church that relates to this story, but I'm going to assume that the reason you're even here or you're listening is that God's already opened your eyes, your spiritual eyes, to this reality. Let's move on to 2 Samuel chapter 10. So back up a few pages. 2 Samuel chapter 10. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 343. We're going to read it all. And keep that Bible open. We've got some more reading to do tonight, too. Sometime later, when the king of the people of Ammon died, his son Hanun became king in his place. And David said, I'll show grace to Hanun, the son of Nahash, as his father showed grace to me. So David sent his servants to pass him a message of comfort concerning his father. Now David's servants entered the territory of the people of Ammon, but the leaders of the people of Ammon said to Hanun, their lord, do you really think David is honoring your father by sending people to comfort you? Hasn't David actually sent his servants to you in order to look the city over and reconnoiter it and overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half of their beards, cut off their clothes halfway up at their buttocks, and sent them on their way. And on hearing how they'd been treated, David sent a delegation to meet them because the men had come back deeply humiliated. And the king said, stay in Jericho until your beards have grown back and then return. Now aware that they were utterly aberrant to David, the people of Ammon sent and hired 20,000 Aram foot soldiers from Beit Rehov and from Zovah. The king of Makkah with 1,000 men and 12,000 soldiers from Toph. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab, with his entire army of trained soldiers. And the army of Ammon came out and went into battle formation at the entrance to the city gate. And the men of Aram from Zovah and Rehov and the men of Tov and Makkah were by themselves in the open countryside. And when Joab saw that he would be fighting on two fronts, ahead and behind, he chose the best troops of Israel to deploy against Aram. And the rest of the army he put under the command of Abishai, his brother, to deploy against the army of Ammon. He said, if Aram is too strong for me, you come and help me. But if the army of Ammon is too strong for you, I'll come and help you. Take courage. Let's be strong for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God. May Adonai do what seems good to him. So Joab and the people with him went to battle Aram, and they fled before him. And when the people of Ammon saw that Aram had fled, they likewise fled from before Abishai and retreated into the city. Joab returned from the people of Ammon and went to Jerusalem. And when Aram saw that Israel had gotten the better of them, they gathered themselves together. Hadadezer sent and brought out the people of Aram, who lived beyond the Euphrates River. And they came to Helam with Shovak, the commander of Hadadezer's army, at their head. And it was reported to David. So he gathered all of Israel together, and he crossed the Jordan, and he came to Helam. Aram deployed themselves against David and fought him. But Aram fled before Israel. David killed 700 chariot drivers and 40,000 horsemen from Aram. And he struck Shovak, the commander of their army, so that he died there. And when all Hadadezer's vassal kings saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel, and they became their subjects. So Aram was afraid to help the people of Ammon anymore. So now David, at this point, has reached his pinnacle in faith and in power. Now I spoke to you a few weeks ago, back in lesson 12 of our 2 Samuel series, about how it seems as though it's after the great Bible heroes have reached their spiritual zenith that they succumb to their evil inclinations, outside temptations, and their own flawed character. Thus, what we have beginning with this chapter is a section of the Bible that we could easily entitle The Decline of David. The story is about the war with the Ammonites and the Syrians, Aram. And we're going to look at it in depth, but as a kind of preliminary overview, we can say that these two wars were likely the most serious, hard-fought, fiercest, the most extraordinarily dangerous wars that happened during David's 40 years on Israel's throne. Israel suffered greatly. It was terrible. The death toll was enormous. The exhaustion was overwhelming because no sooner had some hard-won battle victories over the Syrians been celebrated than the Edomites would overrun the land in hopes of destroying God's chosen people. These battles and their consequences are told in a parallel account in 1 Chronicles 19. Both this 2 Samuel chapter 10 and 1 Chronicles chapter 19 accounts tell the war history in a typically biblical scarcity of detail. However, there were at least 2 psalms that were written to express the anguish, the fear, the distress of those times, and they do add to the emotion and the inner turmoil that's otherwise missing from these battle accounts that we read in kind of a sterile fashion. These Psalms are numbered 44 and 60. And I think that it's impossible to go forward studying 2 Samuel 10 without the context of these 2 hard-hitting Psalms. Now, the first one that we're going to read was written by a properly pious member of the Korah clan, a clan of Levites. The second psalm was by David. We're going to pause and we're going to read them both. So turn your Bibles first to Psalm 44. Psalm 44. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 833. Psalm 44. For the leader by the descendants of Korah. God, we heard it with our ears. Our fathers told us about it. A deed which you did in their days, back in the days of old. With your hand you drove out nations to plant them in the land. You crushed peoples to make room for them. For not by their own swords did they conquer the land, nor did their own arm give them victory. Rather, it was your right hand, your arm, the light of your face, because you favored them. God, you are my king. Command complete victory for Jacob. Through you we pushed away our foes. Through your name we trampled down our assailants. For I don't rely on my bow, nor can my sword give me victory. No, you saved us from our adversaries. You put to shame those who hate us. We will boast in our God all day. Give thanks to your name forever. Yet now you have thrust us aside. You've disgraced us. You don't march out with our armies. You make us retreat from the adversary. And those who hate us plunder us at will. You have handed us over like sheep to be eaten, scattered among the nations. You sell your people for a pittance. You don't even profit on the sale. You make us an object for our neighbors to mock, one of scorn and derision to those around us. You make us a byword among the nations. The people jeer at us, shaking their heads. All day long my disgrace is on my mind. My shame has covered my face. At the sound of those who revile and insult, at the sign of the enemy bent on revenge. Though all this came on us, we didn't forget you. We've not been false to your covenant. Our hearts have not turned back. Our steps did not turn away from your path, though you pressed us into a lair of jackals and covered us with death-dark gloom. If we had forgotten the name of our God, or spread out our hands to a foreign God, Wouldn't God have discovered this, since he knows the secret of the heart? For your sake, we're put to death all day long. We are considered sheep to be slaughtered. Wake up, Adonai! Why are you asleep? Rouse yourself. Don't thrust us off forever. Why are you turning your face away? Forgetting our pain and our misery. For we're lying flat in the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Get up! Come and help us for the sake of your grace. Redeem us. Let's move quickly now to Psalm 60. Page 848 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. For the leader set to lily of testimony, a miktam of David for teaching about when he fought with Aram Naharaim and Aram Sovah, and Joab returned and killed 12,000 from Edom in the Salt Valley. God, you rejected us, you crushed us, you were angry, but now revive us. You made the land shake, split it apart. Now repair the rifts, for it's collapsing. You made your people suffer hard times, had us drink a wine that made us stagger. To those who fear you because of the truth, you gave a banner to rally around, so that those you love could be rescued. So save with your right hand and answer us. God in his holiness spoke, and I took joy in his promise. I will divide Shechem and determine the shares of the Sukkot Valley. Gilead is mine, Manasseh is mine, Ephraim is my helmet, Judah is my scepter, Moab is my washpot, and on Edom I throw my shoe. Philistines, be crushed because of me. Who will bring me into the fortified city? Who will lead me to Edom? God, have you rejected us? You didn't go out with our armies, God. Help us against our enemy, for human help's worthless. With God's help, we will fight valiantly, for he will trample our enemies. Both Korah and David knew something was terribly wrong here. Whereas not that many years ago, nations trembled when the armies of God's kingdom arrived. Now they're confident. They're fearless against Israel. Whereas in an earlier part of David's reign, the victories were certain, they were relatively easy. Now the outcome was regularly in question, and the Israelite losses were horrible. Both psalm writers had the good sense to pray, to ask Yehovah, why has it become this way? Why, God, have you abandoned your people? And at the same time, they asked for strength and redemption from heaven, because they knew that all victory belongs to the Lord. It's fascinating that God's worshipers, almost to a fault, ask if God has abandoned them, abandoned us, when bad things happen, rather than asking the more logical question, how have we pulled away from you, God? How have we done that? The Midrash Bamidbar Rabbah says that this daunting episode is a clear illustration of the God principle that whoever a leader of Israel might be that tries to deal with the evil and the rebellious and God's sworn enemies in a kind or in a tolerant or in an even-handed way is going to eventually find himself suffering, as well as cause suffering upon the Israelite people for their folly of a foolishly misplaced humanitarian concern and their, or our, contrived ideas of what constitutes love and mercy. Thus, while the first two verses of 2 Samuel chapter 10 reports that while David behaved with noble intentions towards the nation of Ammon, his outstretched hand of friendship was misinterpreted as treachery, and no doubt in the Middle East is a sign of weakness. So instead of the results of his peace initiative being what David had hoped for, the outcome was a bloody war that also had much to do with emboldening other enemy nations into thinking that perhaps this was their moment to finally annihilate God's people once and for all. And when David sought to show support for Ammon's new king, Hanun, he also broke a Torah commandment from Deuteronomy 23:7. Deuteronomy 23:7. Never seek their peace or well-being as long as you live. David ignored this commandment, and it proved costly for his nation. But it's instructional for us that this theological error seems to be where adherents to Judaism and Christianity tend to wander. For some reason, God's worshipers tend to fall so much in love with love and with God's concern for humanity that we believe we can disregard all of his other commandments with impunity if we just throw a band-aid of love over the whole thing. We tend to think, especially after several years as believers or as leaders of ministry, that we now have license to make value judgments that supersedes what is written down for us in the Holy Scriptures. We trust our own hearts, often to the exclusion of God's Word. That we do what seems right in our own eyes. So we're shocked, horribly disappointed when things just don't turn out as we're just so certain they should. Today, our elder brothers in the faith, Israel, have succumbed to that trap. It's killing them right now. Over and over, they offer an olive branch of peace to an enemy that says our only goal is to annihilate you. We have no other. And the result is what? More violence, more bloodshed, more hatred towards Israel by the world's community of nations who insist on even more unilateral concessions by Israel as the only solution. The Jewish community is known as some of the world's foremost humanitarians. And at the same time, the Jewish community is despised and reviled, with few exceptions, the world over. A good portion of the church has taken on a similar humanitarian mantle and often comforts and serves God's enemies, all the time ignoring Israel's plight in the name of following Christ. Pay very close attention to what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 10, as it is but one of several examples in the Tanakh of the results of thinking that our own sense of morality is superior to God's commandments. We'll continue with chapter 10 next time. Please rise.